What's the most horrible thing you found out about someone after their death? I came home from my 12-hour shift, eager as always, to see our golden retriever, Harper. But instead of hearing excited yips and happy feet, there was nothing but silence. My husband was sitting in our living room, still as a statue. He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes and said, "Harp's gone. And before you ask, she's already been cremated." It felt like he'd punched me in the face. He pushed a euthanasia form across the table, showing that he'd signed for the procedure that afternoon, right when I was in the middle of surgery and couldn't be reached. I screamed so hard, my throat went raw, calling him a monster. How could he execute my dog? He knew she was the only reason I got out of bed some mornings, but he killed her anyway. Harper had gotten me through my mother's death and 2 miscarriages, and now she was just gone without even a chance to say goodbye. She was an innocent, perfect creature, and he'd killed her when he knew I was tied up and couldn't stop him. I screamed at him that he'd always been jealous of the bond one had with Harper, and the fact that she could make me feel better when he was too much of an impotent man-up to support me. I grabbed a framed photo of us 3 at the beach and threw it at his head, missing but shattering glass across the hardwood floor where Harper used to sprawl out during dinner. He wouldn't even fight back or defend himself, which made me angrier. At least if he yelled, I could hate him properly instead of seeing him just stand there with his shoulders shaking. "You need to see the video from the pet camera before you say another word," my husband finally said. He had to practically pin me down and force me to look at his phone. Harper was in the backyard acting completely wrong, snapping at invisible threats and foaming at the mouth. She attacked our fence so viciously that blood streaked the white boards, then turned in circles, biting at her own legs with a savagery that made my medical training kick in immediately. My husband's voice broke as he explained that he'd called animal control first, but they said any dog showing those symptoms needed immediate euthanasia because rabies had been confirmed in 3 raccoons in our neighborhood that week. He tried calling me 17 times, but I don't get any service when I'm in surgery. So he had to make the choice alone. He'd begged them to wait for me, but they said they couldn't let Harper stay alive and potentially infect someone else. He admitted that he was relieved that I wouldn't get a chance to get close to her because he was so scared she would infect me. He'd rushed the cremation because the body was considered hazardous medical waste, and he didn't want me to see Harper in that state or risk exposure to infected tissue. The vet said, "If Harper bit you while you were trying to help her, you'd die. No one survives rabies." I remembered with horror that Harper had killed a raccoon 5 days ago in our backyard, and we'd laughed about our brave protector, never imagining the raccoon had been sick. That's when I realized that the man I'd been raging at was actually my hero. He'd saved me from either watching Harper die in agony and kept me from risking my own life in order to keep her comfortable. The rage drained out of me as I realized he'd taken on this traumatic burden alone to spare me from having to choose between my love for Harper and my safety, knowing I'd hate him for it, but doing it anyway. My heart shattered thinking about him and Harper, my 2 favorite people in the world, suffering the worst day of their life while I was oblivious at work. We spent the next hour crying together while he told me how Harper had seemed confused but trusting when he brought her to the vet and how he'd sung her favorite silly song while she passed. The vet had been crying too, because she'd known Harper since she was a puppy. But she said my husband did the bravest and most loving thing possible under the circumstances. We were finally preparing to get up and go to bed when I noticed him staring at the ceiling fan like it was spinning too fast, blinking hard, and rubbing his throat. I asked if he was okay, and he said, "The lights are giving me a migraine and my throat feels like I swallowed glass," he said, and my blood turned to ice. I thought about my husband alone with our rabid dog, and I just knew. I grabbed his left hand and found deep puncture wounds across his palm. I managed to choke out, "Did she bite you?" He nodded slowly and held up his left hand. The deep puncture marks across his palm already looking red and puffy around the edges. My stomach dropped as I grabbed his wrist and pulled his hand closer to the lamp, seeing how the skin was already starting to swell and turn an angry pink color. The bite marks were deep. 4 clear puncture wounds where Harper's teeth had gone straight through the skin, and I could see dried blood caked around each hole. I jumped up so fast I knocked over my water glass, telling him we had to get to the hospital right now. Not in 10 minutes, not after we grabbed our insurance cards, but immediately. He started to say something about it, probably being fine, but I was already running to our bedroom, throwing on the scrubs I'd worn earlier that were still draped over the chair. My hospital badge was still clipped to the pocket, and I grabbed my purse while yelling at him to get his shoes on. When I ran back to the living room, he was still sitting there looking confused. So, I explained in a rush that rabies has a really narrow window for treatment, and once symptoms start showing, it's basically a death sentence. His face went white, and he stumbled getting up, almost tripping over his own feet as he shoved his feet into his sneakers without even untying them. I grabbed the car keys, and we rushed out to the garage, him holding his injured hand against his chest while I started the car with shaking hands. The drive to the emergency room felt like it took forever, even though I was going way over the speed limit, taking turns too fast, and running through yellow lights that were definitely turning red. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles hurt while he sat quietly beside me, pressing his palm against his shirt and wincing every time we hit a bump. Every red light made me want to scream because I kept thinking about what I knew from medical school, that once rabies symptoms appear, the survival rate is basically zero. And he'd already said his throat hurt and the lights were bothering him. At the ER entrance, I pulled right up to the doors, even though you're not supposed to park there, and we rushed inside to the intake desk where a tired-looking nurse barely glanced up from her computer. I told her we needed immediate treatment for possible rabies exposure, and she gave me this skeptical look, probably thinking I was overreacting like most people do. But when I pulled out my hospital ID and explained I was a surgeon here and my husband had been bitten by our rabid dog who'd just been put down, her whole attitude changed instantly. She stood up so fast her chair rolled backward and called for someone to take us straight back, bypassing the whole waiting room full of people with broken bones and stomach bugs. A nurse led us to a trauma room, and within minutes, the ear doctor arrived, a younger guy I recognized from staff meetings, but had never worked with directly. He put on gloves and carefully examined the puncture wounds while I explained everything really fast about Harper's symptoms. The foaming mouth, the aggression, the confirmed raid raccoons in our neighborhood that week. He kept nodding and said we were absolutely doing the right thing because with symptoms already presenting, we couldn't afford to wait for any test results. 2 nurses came in with supplies and they started cleaning the wounds with an intensity that made my husband grip the bed rail with his good hand. They were flushing each puncture with what looked like gallons of saline solution, then scrubbing with betadine until the whole room smelled like iodine. The nurse explained they had to flush out any virus particles that might still be in the tissue because the rabies virus travels through nerve tissue to the brain. I held his other hand while he gritted his teeth, trying not to yell as they irrigated each wound over and over. The saline running pink with blood into the basin they held underneath. The doctor came back carrying a tray with several vials and explained he'd be injecting rabies immunoglobulin directly into and around the bite wounds, warning us it would hurt significantly because they had to infiltrate all the tissue around each puncture. My husband just nodded and squeezed my hand harder. As the doctor started injecting, the needle going in again and again around each tooth mark, pushing the medicine deep into the tissue. I could see tears running down his face, but he didn't make a sound. Just kept squeezing my hand so hard I thought my fingers might break. After what felt like forever getting the immunoglobulin into the wound sites, they gave him the first dose of rabies vaccine in his upper arm along with a tetanus shot just to be safe. The doctor explained he'd need to come back on days 3, 7, and 14 for the rest of the vaccine series, and that missing any of them could be fatal since the immunoglobulin only buys time for the vaccine to work. Then the doctor asked to speak with me privately and we stepped into the hallway where he asked detailed questions about my own exposure risk, whether I'd had any contact with Harper's saliva in the past 10 days. I explained I hadn't even seen her for 2 days before today because of my crazy work schedule, and he said I probably didn't need treatment but to monitor myself closely for any symptoms. Just as we were finishing up, a woman from the billing department showed up with a tablet. I'm trying to understand how the husband managed to handle all of this alone. Getting Harper to the vet while she was raid must have been incredibly dangerous. Did he use a catchpole or thick gloves? And started explaining the costs. And my stomach dropped when she said the rabies immunoglobulin alone was $8,000 per vial and my husband had needed 3 based on his weight. Adding in the vaccines at $2,000 each dose, the ER visit, the wound care and everything else, We were looking at close to $30,000 before insurance, and she wasn't even sure how much our plan would cover since rabies treatment was considered a special case. The nurse finally brought us the discharge papers at 3 o'clock in the morning along with a stack of appointment cards for the rest of the vaccine series. My husband moved like an old man as we walked to the car, holding his bandaged hand against his chest. I did the math in my head while driving us home. Even if insurance covered half, we'd need at least $15,000. That meant picking up every extra shift I could get for the next 6 months. The house felt wrong when we got back. Too quiet without Harper's breathing from her bed in the corner. Neither of us could sleep, so we ended up on the couch. My husband started telling me what really happened that afternoon. His voice cracked when he described Harper trying to attack a group of kids playing on the sidewalk. She'd been foaming at the mouth and snarling like she didn't even know him. He'd had to grab her collar and drag her inside while she bit at his arms. The kids had been crying and their parents were already calling animal control. He showed me his phone and played a voice memo he'd recorded right after getting back from the vet. I could hear him sobbing in the recording as he explained why he couldn't wait for me. He kept saying he was sorry over and over and that he hoped I'd understand someday. Listening to how broken he sounded just hours ago made my chest hurt. I told him I was sorry for the things I'd said earlier. The next morning, someone named Theo Steelbridge called from Public Health. He needed to document Harper's case for their rabies tracking system. When I explained she'd been cremated, he got quiet for a long moment. He said the cremation meant they couldn't test her brain tissue to confirm rabies. Without that confirmation, they couldn't properly track how the outbreak was spreading through our area. He asked a bunch of questions about where we walked Harper and which animals she might have come in contact with. I gave him the vet's number, and he said he'd follow up with them directly. After that call, I phoned the vet's office myself and asked to speak with whoever had put Harper down. The vet remembered everything clearly because Harper had been her patient since she was 8 weeks old. She told me Harper's pupils had been completely dilated and fixed when they brought her in. Her back legs were starting to show paralysis, and she was having trouble swallowing. Those were all late-stage rabies symptoms. That meant Harper was already dying. The vet said my husband had made the only choice possible. Around noon, the animal control officer showed up to inspect our backyard. He took photos of every spot of blood on the fence where Harper had hurt herself. He measured the height of the blood splatter and wrote notes about the bite marks in the wood. Then, he put on a respirator mask and sprayed industrial disinfectant over the entire fence line. The chemical smell was so strong it made my eyes water from inside the house. He told us to stay out of the yard for at least 2 weeks while the disinfectant worked. He also said we needed to report any wild animals we saw acting strange. While he was working, I started my battle with the insurance company about covering the rest of the vaccine doses. The first person transferred me 3 times before I got someone who even knew what post-exposure prophylaxis meant. She kept putting me on hold to check with supervisors about our coverage limits. I explained over and over that this wasn't optional, that my husband would die without the full series. She said she understood, but still needed to verify our benefits. After an hour, she came back and said they'd only cover vaccines given at in-network facilities. The ER we'd gone to was out of network, so we'd have to pay full price for those doses. I asked if she understood that we went to the closest ER because rabies exposure is a medical emergency. She said she'd note that in our file for the appeal process. The appeal could take 6 to 8 weeks to process. Meanwhile, my husband had started going through Harper's things in the garage. He wore thick rubber gloves because we didn't know what might have her saliva on it. Each toy went into a black garbage bag along with her food bowls and leashes. I found him sitting on the garage floor holding her favorite tennis ball and crying. He said it still smelled like her. We had to throw away her dog bed, her blankets, everything she'd touched in the last week. It felt like losing her all over again with each item we bagged. That evening, my husband's temperature spiked to 101 degrees. He started getting muscle aches in his shoulders and back. The discharge paper said these were normal side effects from the vaccines, but I couldn't stop worrying. I checked his temperature every hour and kept shining my phone flashlight in his eyes to check his pupils. He told me to stop, but I couldn't help myself. Every time he winced or rubbed his neck, I wondered if the treatment was failing. After he finally fell asleep on the couch, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop reading medical journals about rabies treatment. Most of the studies said the vaccines were 99% effective when given quickly after exposure, but that 1% kept sticking in my mind. I found case reports of people who got the full treatment but still developed rabies weeks later. The papers described how the virus could sometimes hide in nerve tissue where the antibodies couldn't reach it. Once symptoms started, there was nothing anyone could do. I kept reading until my eyes burned, looking for any sign that would tell me if the treatment was working or not. The doorbell rang early the next morning, and I found our neighbor standing there with his phone already out. He showed me footage from his doorbell camera from 5 days ago, and my stomach dropped as I watched Harper grab that raccoon by the throat. The video was clear enough to see the raccoon's claws raking across Harper's face while she shook it hard. Blood sprayed across our driveway as Harper's teeth sank deeper and the raccoon twisted to bite her muzzle. I could pinpoint the exact second when infected saliva probably got into Harper's bloodstream through those scratches. My neighbor said he'd been checking his camera after hearing about what happened and thought we should see this. He backed away from us quickly after showing the video like we might be contagious, too. 2 hours later, we were sitting in plastic chairs at the health department while Theo filled out contact tracing forms. He needed every single person who might have touched Harper in the past 2 weeks. I wrote down the groomer's name, our dog Walker, the kid next door who always gave Harper treats. Each name felt like I was putting someone else's life at risk, even though Theo kept saying Harper wasn't contagious until closer to when she showed symptoms. We spent another hour going through dates and times, trying to remember who petted her at the park last weekend. My husband's handwriting got shakier with each form as the vaccine side effects kicked in harder. His injection sites were swelling and turning purple while we sat there answering questions about Harper's vaccination history. Theo needed her vet records going back 3 years, but our vet's office was closed until Monday. I had to step outside to call my chief of surgery because my hands were shaking too bad to text. She picked up on the third ring and I could hear the oh noise in the background. I told her I needed coverage for my scheduled surgeries because I hadn't slept in 36 hours. She was quiet for a long moment before saying she understood, but this would definitely come up in my performance review. I knew she was already doing the math on how this would affect our department's numbers. When we got home, there was a voicemail from the vet saying Harper's ashes wouldn't be ready for several days. The crematorium needed special permits for potentially infectious remains, and everything had to be handled differently. She offered to meet with us to talk about what happened, but I deleted the message before it finished. I couldn't sit across from her and talk about Harper like she was just another case file. That night, I watched my husband write in a journal documenting every symptom from the vaccines. His handwriting looked like a child's as he described the burning at the injection sites and waves of nausea. He kept stopping to measure his temperature, convinced every normal body sensation was the start of rabies. I wanted to tell him he was being paranoid, but I was doing the same thing, checking his pupils every hour for changes. We finally tried to have a real conversation about what happened while he soaked his swollen arm in ice water. He told me he knew I'd never forgive him if he let me get close to Harper in that state. He chose to be the bad guy rather than risk me getting infected trying to comfort her. He said watching Harper die without me there was the hardest thing he'd ever done. But keeping me safe was worth my hatred. That kind of love made my chest hurt worse than the anger ever had. The next morning, an official letter arrived from the public health department with every appointment mapped out for the next month. 4 more shots on specific dates at specific times with no flexibility for rescheduling. Having it all written down in black and white made it feel more manageable, like following a treatment protocol for a patient. Each date was circled in red with warnings about what would happen if we missed even 1 dose. Why did the husband think to record that voice memo right after putting Harper down? That detail really makes me wonder what was going through his mind. Did he know his wife would need proof of how broken he was? I put on thick rubber gloves and went outside with a bucket of bleach to clean the fence. The blood had dried into dark streaks across the whiteboards and I had to scrub hard to get it off. Halfway through, I suddenly remembered Harper barking happily in this exact spot just last week. My legs gave out and I sat right there on the contaminated ground, sobbing for the dog who died scared and confused. The bleach smell mixed with the memory of her fur and I threw up in the grass. When I came back inside, my husband was staring at his laptop with tears running down his face. Someone had started a thread on our neighborhood forum calling us irresponsible pet owners for letting Harper get rabies. People we'd had barbecues with were asking why we didn't keep our vaccines more current. They said we endangered the whole neighborhood with our negligence and should face charges. My husband read every single comment before I could grab the laptop away from him. His face crumbled as our neighbors questioned whether we should even be allowed to have pets. That night, he deleted all his social media accounts without saying anything, but I knew why. Every happy dog photo on his feed was like a knife twisting in the wound. We were cut off from our yard because of contamination, our neighbors because of judgment, and now our online world, too. The isolation felt complete as we sat in our house that still smelled like Harper's fur. Even our families were keeping their distance after we told them about the exposure, afraid to visit until we finished the full vaccine series. The phone rang while I was staring at Harper's empty food bowl, and I almost didn't answer, but it was the vet's office, so I picked up. The vet explained that Harper's brain tissue showed advanced rabies infection, and the paralysis would have set in within hours, meaning she felt very little pain at the end because her nervous system was already shutting down. She told me about the medical timeline and how Harper was probably confused but not suffering when my husband brought her in, which made me cry harder knowing he'd been right to act fast. The vet mentioned a grief counselor named Addison Bluewater who specialized in traumatic head loss. And I wrote down the number even though I couldn't imagine talking to anyone about this nightmare. 2 days later, I forced myself to call Addison and made an appointment because I couldn't keep replaying that horrible scene where I threw the picture frame at my husband's head. Addison's office smelled like vanilla candles, and she had a box of tissues on every surface which told me she knew what she was doing. I sat on her couch and told her everything, every awful word I'd screamed at my husband while he stood there taking it all because he knew I needed someone to blame. She didn't judge me or tell me I was wrong for being angry. Just nodded and said anger was often the first shield we use against unbearable grief. She helped me see that my husband and I were both trying to protect each other in our own desperate ways. Him by keeping me safe from infection and me by pushing him away so I wouldn't have to face the reality of Harper's death. Day 3 arrived and we drove back to the hospital for his second vaccine dose. Neither of us talking about how his arm was still swollen from the first round of shots. The nurse recognized us and asked how we were holding up while she prepared the syringes. My husband made a dark joke about feeling like a pincushion, but I saw his hands shaking as he rolled up his sleeve for another injection. The immunoglobulin went into his other arm this time, and he winced as the thick liquid burned going in. Then, we had to wait 30 minutes to make sure he didn't have a reaction. After the vaccine, he insisted on going back to work because he said sitting at home was making him crazy. But an hour later, he called me from his office parking lot. He couldn't concentrate on anything and kept having intrusive thoughts about Harper's final moments, seeing her confused face every time he closed his eyes. His boss found him crying at his desk and gave him the rest of the week off. But we both knew this was affecting his career too. Another ripple spreading out from that single raccoon bite in our backyard. I tried to go back to work too, telling myself that surgery would help me focus on something else. But halfway through a routine gallbladder removal, my hands started trembling during a delicate suture. The patient's vitals were stable, but I couldn't stop shaking and had to step out while my resident took over, standing in the hallway hyperventilating while nurses pretended not to notice. My professional identity felt like another casualty of this trauma because I'd never lost control in an O before, never let personal problems affect my ability to operate. My chief called me into her office an hour later for what she called a gentle conversation, but felt like another loss piling on top of everything else. She suggested I take bereavement leave even though Harper was just a dog. Using air quotes that made me want to scream, but I knew she was right about not being safe to operate. Accepting that limitation felt like admitting I was broken, that this trauma had taken my career along with my dog and maybe my marriage too. That afternoon, Theo from Animal Control called with an update that made everything worse. They'd found another raid raccoon 2 streets over and 3 more dogs in the neighborhood were now getting post-exposure shots just like my husband. Knowing we weren't alone in this nightmare provided strange comfort, but also made me realize danger was everywhere, that any animal could be carrying death in its saliva. That night, I couldn't sleep and found myself scrolling through my husband's phone looking for pictures of Harbor when I stumbled on the pet camera footage from that day. My finger hovered over the play button for 10 minutes before I finally pressed it. And there was my husband holding Harper at the vet's office while she snapped at the air in confusion. His voice was so tender as he sang her favorite silly song about being a good golden girl, the one I used to sing during her baths, and he kept hitting her even when she tried to bite him. The vet was crying in the background, and my husband's voice cracked when he told Harbor that Mommy loved her so much and would see her on the Rainbow Bridge someday. I finally understood the full magnitude of his sacrifice because he gave her comfort while accepting that I would hate him for it, choosing to be the villain so I could keep my last memories of Harbor pure. The next morning, I found a voice memo on his phone from that day recorded while he was driving to the vet with Harbor in the back seat. He described what those 17 failed calls felt like. Each ring that went to voicemail representing another moment where he had to make an impossible decision alone. His voice broke as he explained standing in the vet's office knowing I'd never forgive him but doing it anyway because that's what love looks like sometimes. Making the hard choice to protect someone even when it destroys you. 3 days later, we went to a joint therapy session with Addison where we finally named what really happened that day. My husband saved my life by sacrificing his own emotional safety, and I traumatized him with my rage when he was already drowning in grief from losing Harbor too. One resident made a comment during lunch about it being just a dog, and I had to walk out of the break room before I said something that would damage my professional relationships or maybe even my career. That night, we had our first real fight since the initial trauma when I accused my husband of robbing me of the chance to say goodbye by cremating Harper so quickly without even asking me. He reminded me that the vet said her body was considered medical waste and had to be handled immediately to protect public health. But I wasn't ready to be rational about it yet. I just wanted someone to blame for the fact that I never got to hold her one last time. We went to bed angry for the first time in weeks, sleeping on opposite sides of the mattress like strangers. The next morning, we both apologized and reached an uneasy compromise where we agreed to stop watching the pet camera footage that we'd both been obsessively replaying and to put some of Harper's things in storage instead of throwing them away like the vet recommended. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, more like a mutual recognition that we both did our best in an impossible situation. And blaming each other wouldn't bring Harbor back or make the guilt any lighter. Day 14 came faster than I expected, and I drove my husband to the hospital for his last shot while trying not to think about how many times we'd made this trip. The waiting room was the same beige nightmare it always was. But this time, we knew it would be the last time we'd sit in these plastic chairs that made our backs hurt. Leah Fairgrove met us at the door to the exam room, and I noticed how her hands moved over my husband's arm. With the same careful attention she'd shown every visit, she pressed around the injection sites from the previous shots and asked him to squeeze her fingers to test his grip strength, which had gotten better since the first week when he could barely hold a coffee mug. The final shot went into his shoulder, and she kept him for 30 minutes afterward to watch for any bad reactions, even though we'd been through this routine enough times to know nothing would happen. She sat down across from us and explained that while the medical danger was over, his body might still feel weird for months because trauma doesn't just disappear when the shots are done. My husband nodded and asked if the nightmares about foaming at the mouth would stop, and she said, maybe not right away, but they would fade. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived from the public health department with official letterhead that made my hands shake as I opened it. The letter said my husband had completed all required treatment for rabies exposure and was no longer considered at risk for developing the disease. We stood in the hallway where Harper's leash used to hang on its special hook, and my husband grabbed the hammer from the kitchen drawer while I held the frame we'd bought at the drugstore. The nail went in crooked the first time, and we had to pull it out and try again. But finally, the framed letter hung there like the world's weirdest diploma. 2 weeks after that, we were ready to face the backyard again, even though the fence still had shadows where we'd scrubbed the blood off. Addison arrived right on time, carrying a small oak tree in a black plastic pot that looked too small to hold something that would grow so big. We didn't say much, as my husband dug the hole right where Harper used to sleep in the afternoons when the sun hit that spot just right. The soil was harder than we expected, and it took both of us taking turns with the shovel while Addison held the tree steady. When we finally got it planted and the dirt packed down around it, I poured water from Harbor's old outdoor bowl that we'd kept for some reason. Addison said a few words about growth and healing, but I was mostly watching a squirrel run along the fence and thinking about how Harbor would have chased it. Going back to work had been its own challenge, but my chief had been patient with my shaky first attempts at holding a scalpel steady. Today, though, I had a gallbladder removal scheduled, and my hands felt solid as I made the first incision. The surgery went exactly as it should, with no surprises and no complications. Even though I caught myself checking my gloves for tears 3 times more than necessary, my chief watched from the observation deck, and when I finished the last suture, he gave me a small nod that meant more than any words could have. That night, we were lying in bed, not quite ready to sleep, when my husband started talking about how different we were now. He said watching me scream at him that first night had been the worst moment, but also showed him I could survive anything, even hating him. I told him that seeing him make that choice alone to protect me, even knowing I'd blame him forever, changed how I understood what love really meant. We weren't the same people who'd adopted Harbor as a puppy 8 years ago, and maybe that was okay, even if it hurt. The next morning brought the mail with another envelope that made my stomach drop because I recognized the hospital billing department's return address. The number at the bottom of the page might as well have been $1 million for how impossible it looked. Insurance had covered some of it, but $43,000 was still more than we had in savings and checking combined. We sat at the kitchen table with a loan application from our credit union and filled out each line, knowing this meant no vacation for 5 years and no new car when mine finally died. My husband signed first and then passed the pen to me, and we both knew this was just another price we'd pay. A week later, I called the vet's office and asked if we could set up a small fund for families dealing with rabies exposure. The receptionist transferred me to the vet herself, and she started crying when I explained we wanted to use Harper's name for it. She told me Harper had been one of her favorite patients, and that what we went through was the hardest thing she'd seen in 20 years of practice. When she said Harper was lucky to have people who loved her enough to make impossible choices, I almost believed it was true. Every night now, I still walk to the door and reach for the leash that isn't there before. I remember. My husband still looks at his palm where the scars have faded to thin white lines that you wouldn't notice unless you knew where to look. We're learning to live with the empty spaces and the knowledge that everything safe can turn dangerous in 5 days. Wow, what a ride this one was. And thanks for coming along and exploring all these moments with me. Seriously means a lot. Can't wait to share more stories with you soon. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.